Welcome to Nature Revisited, a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. My name is Stefan Van Norden, and thank you, everyone, for listening. I am joined today by Alex Matthiessen. For this episode, my father and his legacy. Recently, I learned of the Peter Matthiessen Center and the Peter Matthiessen Literary Prize. Peter Matthiessen was a literary lion whose work, both fiction and nonfiction, consisted of over 30 books over the course of 6 decades. Peter Matthiessen was the only writer to receive the National Book Award for both fiction and nonfiction. His works included The Snow Leopard, At Play in the Field of the Lord, Far Tortuga, The Tree Where Man Was Born, Shadow Country, and In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, just to name a few. So I contacted Alex and the Peter Matthiessen Center to learn more about what they were doing and to see if Alex would join me on the podcast to share some of his thoughts about his father and the creation of the Peter Matthiessen Center and Literary Prize. Here then is my conversation with Alex about his father, himself, and his father's legacy. So Alex, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
Stefan, it's very nice to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
So let's start at the beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in the hamlet of Sagaponack, which is a Native American name from the local Montaukett or perhaps Shinnecock tribe, I'm not sure which. It's on the east end of Long Island, about 100 miles east of New York City. And I grew up there for the first 13, 14 years of my life until I went off to boarding school.
Did you live with your father? And how was your relationship with him as a youth?
My relationship with him was always very good. That's not to say he was a terrific father. He was quite a flawed father in many ways. My mother died when I was 7 years old, so until I was 7, it was me and my father and my mother, and to a lesser extent, my older sister, Rue. She went off to boarding school pretty early on. And for a couple of years there, it was just my father and me from about age 7 to 10. And then his new wife, Maria Matthiessen, moved in with her 2 daughters. That was the kind of core household for the next bunch of years. And around age of 13 or 14, I went off to boarding school.
So why was Sagaponack, New York, so important to you growing up? And how different is it today?
Sagaponack and Bridgehampton and East Hampton are the towns that are part of the South Fork of the East End of Long Island, is a euphemism for what has now become known as the Hamptons, which has become a very fancy area, extremely wealthy. The place is not the same as it was when I was growing up, and so I'm slightly embarrassed by that association. But I was very lucky to grow up there. Make no mistake, it was a very rural area back in the 60s and 70s. Farmers, tradespeople, writers and artists, a real strong local community. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was beautiful. It was really a rural area. It was a special place to grow up. And the most distinguishing thing about the East End of Long Island is the light. Beautiful, beautiful light. Grew up a quarter mile from the ocean, so I spent a lot of time in the ocean. And the beaches are world class. They're world famous. It was really a remarkable place, and I consider myself very lucky to have grown up there. That said, probably around the time of the bicentennial, 1976, the Hamptons became very popular with kind of jet setters and wealthy folks on Wall Street. And so an increasing number of people started buying homes out there and creating McMansions and the like. And today, it's a much different place. It still has the light, it still has the beautiful beaches and the ocean, and there's still interesting people here, but it's also very wealthy. There's a lot of entitlement. It's not the same place, but it has maintained a few of its essential qualities in terms of the light and the ocean and the beaches and other things.
So do you think your father would recognize the place?
Well, yes, of course, because he died exactly 10 years ago. He deplored it. He had all kinds of fantasies over many years of escaping the Hamptons. He loved the East End. He made this his home. He lived here for 55 years, so this is no question this was his home, and this is the place he identified as home. But I think the kind of onslaught of wealthy, entitled people just wasn't what he enjoyed. And so he enjoyed the good parts of it. He traveled much of the year, and that was really for his work. It wasn't just to kind of escape this place. His work was about exploring far-flung destinations and indigenous people and wildlife and doing that reporting. So that kept him away from the area for probably on average about 6 months of the year. But he did, as I said, he had a fantasy of finding a little writing studio somewhere. And he had this idea of building a little writing cottage and escaping there in the summer. But he never did because he was such a workaholic. Taking off a year or two to build a house or even a cottage was never going to happen. But it was a nice dream he had.
So how did your father communicate his love of nature to you?
You know, really, to be honest, he communicated it through his books. And to a lesser extent, the articles he wrote, the occasional op-ed. In terms of his communicating his love of nature to us kids, he really didn't do that. And that's one of his failings as a father. He was a pretty knowledgeable naturalist. He spent summers on Fisher's Island, and he had collected snakes and turtles and frogs and really loved nature and loved animals from a very early age. He did all that with his younger brother. And then, of course, from all of his travels around the world, he used to do a lot of bird watching. One of his first nonfiction books was Wildlife in America, which is a chronicling of the status and state of wildlife in this country. And he was particularly interested in those species that were threatened or endangered. And so he really had a lot of knowledge to impart, but he was the classic artist who was completely focused on his work. So he just didn't really have time or didn't make the time. I got most of it because I was naturally more inclined to be an outdoors person, and I took more of an interest in it. I benefited from that. But he really wasn't the kind of father who would take you on a nature walk and show you all the different insects and trees and so on. So he really, to answer your original question, he really imparted that knowledge and that passion for the natural world through his writing.
When did your father first become interested in social justice? And did he explain to you that was connected to the way people mistreat the natural world?
Yeah, I would probably frame it a little bit differently, but the way I think about his early interest in social justice and the environment and so on is that, as I said, as a boy, he grew up spending a lot of time in the woods and collecting different animals and snakes and frogs and the like. And he got into birds very early on. And so I think that it really began with his love of nature. But I will also say that as he became a young man in his teenage years into high school and college, I think he really started to resent and have disdain for his own cultural, socioeconomic background, which was that of an upper middle class WASP. It's hard to kind of pinpoint why he had that feeling when a lot of his other friends probably didn't even recognize it as such, but he was sensitive to his background. He came from a family that had money, and that he was very well educated and all those things, and so he became attuned to that. And so I think as he became a young man and he started to develop his craft and to write and to explore and to travel around the world and do research and so on, I think it started primarily with his love of nature. Then I think what happened, which makes sense to me, is that the more he studied all the environmental problems, all the assaults that man was having on nature, he started to realize that it was often, not always, but often very connected to social injustice as well. For instance, the connection between our oppression of Native American people here in the U.S. And then you look at so many other examples too, the subsistence fishermen that he wrote about on the east end of Long Island. They were overseeing for, a generations old, centuries old fishing community. They were fishing very sustainably with non-high technology. The recreational fishermen, the kind of Hamptonite types, managed to pass laws in Albany that made it increasingly difficult for commercial fishermen to thrive. In time after time, you saw that there was a real connection between how we as a society were treating indigenous people who were living off the land, living off the water, and the fate of our environment. I think that's where he originally probably made the connection. And then I think he just became interested in indigenous cultures for their own sake because they were fascinating. He was a very curious person, and he had an endless appetite for travel and for going to new places, going to often distant and sometimes dangerous places, and learning about new cultures and seeing new examples of God's work in terms of nature. And so I think that's how I see it. The final leg of that journey is, and then when he made the connection between our exploitation of nature and natural resources and the kind of social injustice that often went along with it, it all kind of circled back to the wealthier class, the industrial class, the capitalist class, that he kind of, from an early age, was skeptical of. And so I think he became passionate about the connections between those three things, that we were really responsible for ravaging the planet in the pursuit of profit. And it upset him deeply. Every book he ever wrote, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, has that thread throughout, which is his love of nature, his concern about nature and the natural world, and usually some element of what humans are doing to destroy it.
So when did he start to travel around the world to focus his attention on other indigenous people and cultures?
So he probably was exposed a little bit to other cultures and other countries and so on as a young boy and teenager, going on vacations with his family and so on. During World War II, the tail end of World War II, he joined the Navy, became a laundryman on a ship that was stationed just outside of Pearl Harbor. I think he got more interested there in other cultures and the Hawaiian culture. And let me say very clearly, he started out with the intention of being a novelist. That's how he saw himself. I think that's where he thought his skills, his talents lay. And he did write a few novels early on, but they never kind of got much attention. And so I think he started realizing that as he discovered and as he did all this traveling and learned about these different cultures and places, because of his passion about that, he started to write about it. And then those articles that he might have been writing for the New Yorker and other magazines, he realized that they were often the basis for a whole book. So he ended up doing a lot of nonfiction writing alongside the novels. And that was really, those are the books that he was most well known for.
So when and how did you first realize that your father was Peter Matthiessen?
I honestly have no idea. I was thinking about that. When did I actually realize that my father was a pretty well-known and popular person who was very well respected in the literary community? I think for the son of an artist, painter, writer, and so on, it may not be so obvious. First of all, you take what he does for granted. He goes out to the studio every day. He travels around the world doing research and going on these expeditions. And it just becomes so part of the tapestry of your life that you don't even really think about it. And also, my father was a well-known and very well-respected writer, but he was never a celebrity in that sense. I can't think of a time or a moment or an incident that pinpoints when I was like, oh my God, I guess my dad's kind of a big shot. It really was kind of a gradual understanding that, oh, okay, he's a writer. And certainly the people around our family, on the east end of Long Island and so on, treated him differently. But that was also not just because he was a writer of renown and had a good reputation and so on, but he was also extremely charming, very good looking. So he kind of had an effect on people. Certainly the shine of being an artist that helped kind of distinguish him from other people in the community.
So your father is probably best known for his book, The Snow Leopard, about his journey to Nepal in 1973, about a year and a half after your mother's death. Why was that expedition so important to him?
I think the expedition was important to him for a number of reasons, but a big one was that my mother had just died. To be clear, they had a very stormy relationship. They loved each other a lot, but they did have a stormy relationship, and they were, in fact, heading for divorce when she became ill with cancer. So there was an effort to try and salvage the marriage, and, he was very much there for her. It must have been excruciatingly painful to lose somebody that you loved so much and had so much history with, and yet at the same time had a difficult relationship. They were heading for divorce. And so I think that probably made him feel quite guilty. So I think he has soul searching and some self-healing that he had to do in the wake of my mother's death. The other big reason was that he had just gotten into Zen Buddhism a few years before. In fact, my mother was the one that turned him on to it. My dad famously said that he turned her on to LSD and other hallucinogenics, and that she turned him on to Zen Buddhism not long after, and that he got the better deal because the acid and the drugs and so on were interesting, but they weren't lasting, they weren't enduring. He got into Zen Buddhism in the late 60s and early 70s, and then she died, and I think he really committed himself to the study of Buddhism. The third thing is just that he had done a little bit of work with George Schaller, the wildlife biologist who was heading up this expedition to the Himalayas to study the blue sheep, actually, not the snow leopard. And he had some encounters with George in the Serengeti in East Africa and really admired him and enjoyed his company. And so George said, hey, listen, I'm going to the Himalayas, and you're welcome to come if you'd like. And my dad jumped at the opportunity because of the things I mentioned.
Were you able to accompany your father on any of his expeditions or journeys?
Yes. As I said earlier, my dad's main focus was his work. So you would think, oh, God, we must have traveled all over the world and so on. But, those were work trips for him. And while they were very enjoyable for him, he was working. I certainly did travel with him a number of times, and a couple of memorable ones. We went to Churchill up in Manitoba in Canada to do a bird watching trip. And that was my first real exposure to bird watching, which I fell in love with. When I was much younger, when I was 4 or 5 years old, and then again when I was 10, we spent whole summers in East Africa and Tanzania, where he was doing research. We did quite a few safaris together when we were there, and so that was incredibly exciting for a young boy. And then we did a couple of other trips when I was an adult. We went up to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We went on another trip to Greenland. He was doing some research up there. And we actually hunted with the local Inuit, Eskimos. We went and hunted a narwhal whale, a decidedly mixed experience. It was thrilling and exciting in some ways to see these people doing what they've been doing for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And yet it was also very disturbing to see a beautiful creature slaughtered. So I did a good bit of traveling with him, and it was always wonderful. We had a very, very close relationship, which really became closer when I became an adult. He also had quite a lot of anger from his own childhood and issues that he hadn't quite sorted out. Once I was old enough to be his equal, we took that on, and through that process, we became extremely close. So, yeah, we spent a lot of time together.
So you later retraced your father's journey to Nepal with George Schaller. Why was that important to you?
I guess around late 2015, early 2016, I got a call from a guy who was a retired insurance executive. He had a passion for Nepal. He was doing a lot of work to bring electricity to Nepalese villages high up in the Himalaya, and only just recently read The Snow Leopard. He had no idea about this stuff. And so he got very excited about the idea of sponsoring a trip for George to return to Dolpo, which was the region of the Himalayas that he and my father traveled to in 1973, and to bring George back for a reunion of sorts, to retrace steps that my father and he took in 1973. He found out about me and tracked me down, and he said, "How would you like to do this trip? It'd be great to have you accompany us on this trip." I'd gotten to know George a little bit over the years, here and there. At first, I was reluctant to do it. I just thought, well, I really don't deserve to do this trip. And then I realized, wait, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. And I also had quite a few challenges of my own at that time in my life. And so it was just a perfect time for me to pick up and leave and go spend 5 or 6 weeks in the Himalayas. Maybe the most important thing for me was that my father had only died 2 years before. And I just never felt like I had taken the time to properly mourn his death. And so I thought a trip to the Himalayas to retrace that route that he took so many years before that eventually became the Snow Leopard, I just thought that'd be a great way to honor him, to celebrate his life, and even to get to know him in a way. And it was a way for me to rediscover him and reconnect with him, which was very, very important to me. It was a wonderful trip.
When and why did you become an environmentalist?
I always trace it back to my first experience of understanding that man was having a negative impact on the natural world. And that was on a bike ride that my dad and I took in our hometown in Sagaponic. And we were biking along, and we saw a gull, also known as a seagull. But my dad always would tell me that it's a gull. He'd say, "There's no such thing as a seagull, they're gulls." And it was standing by the side of the road, and it was standing on one foot. You could see it was injured. So we got off our bikes, and we approached it, and we saw that it had actually one of those plastic 6-pack rings. It was tangled around the head and the leg and one of the legs of this bird. So he couldn't put his second foot to the ground. We approached him trying to see if we could catch him and remove the plastic. But of course, every time we got almost to him, he would become scared and would just flap his wings and just fly off another 10 feet away from us. And then we kept on repeating that cycle until my father finally said, "We're not going to catch him." And we got back on our bikes, and as we rode home, he said, "It's terrible, but that gull is going to die." I was really upset by that, and I cried, and it was notable because I hadn't cried when my mother died. But that got to me, and I'm sure it was connected to my mother's death. It was tapping into some grief that I hadn't really found at that time. That experience really stayed with me. And then I kind of went on and did school, and it really wasn't until college, when I went to the University of California in Santa Cruz, where I took an introduction to environmental studies class, and it hit me like a hammer. I just was so excited. It resonated with me so much. And it was probably from years of listening to my father around the table and having my own experiences of nature and so on. And just the idea that man was destroying the planet was just deeply upsetting to me. And the possibility that we could do something about it was very exciting to me. So I became an environmental studies major. I then tacked on biology. And then I spent the next 20, 25 years working for various nonprofit organizations like Rainforest Action Network. I worked for Earth Day, the 20th anniversary of Earth Day in 1992 with Dennis Hayes, the original founder. Spent some time in Washington working for the World Wildlife Foundation as a consultant and Conservation International. Eventually, I went back to graduate school and got a degree in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. Went off to Indonesia for a year, and then eventually I came back and joined the Clinton administration and got a job at the U.S. Department of the Interior, where I was a political appointee, and I worked on a bunch of initiatives started something called the Green Energy Parks Initiative, which was where we established a relationship between the Department of Energy and the National Park Service to use the parks as the laboratory and showcase for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And I received a presidential award from the White House for that initiative. I eventually got recruited by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to take over the Riverkeeper organization in the Hudson Valley. The mission of the Hudson Riverkeeper was to protect the Hudson River and to restore it, primarily by suing polluters and getting them to stop polluting. The other half of the mission was protect the New York City watershed. And then over the last 14 years, I've been acting as an environmental consultant. The firm is called Blue Marble Project. And I've worked on a number of initiatives, but the one that's really occupied most of my time and attention over, I hate to say it, but 14 years, is leading an effort to pass something called congestion pricing in New York City. Congestion pricing is a program whereby you toll cars and trucks that enter into a central business district of a major city as a way to both reduce traffic and raise revenue to invest in mass transit. And so I did that for the last 14 years, and we were just about to turn the program on June 30th when Governor Hochul issued this pause of the program, and now we're fighting a rearguard action to get it back on track. The congestion pricing campaign has occupied a large amount of my time and focus and attention because it's an extremely challenging issue to get done here in this country. Americans have such a obsession with their cars and their right to drive and their right to pollute the air and their right to do all that other stuff. As I said, we were just about to turn it on. It was ready to go. Literally 3 weeks before it was set to turn on, the governor got cold feet and decided to hit pause on the program. I'm quite confident that we will get this back on track and we will see congestion pricing happen in New York, hopefully over the next 6 months. Critically important if we're going to save the planet. Every time a polluter pollutes our rivers, our streams, our air, our water, that's imposing a cost on society that they're not bearing. And so by charging fees for polluting behavior, you reduce that behavior, you reduce the pollution. The best example of this is a carbon tax, which would be charged on any use of fossil fuels, which would eventually cause fossil fuels to be phased out. So this is a really important initiative, and other cities around the country have been watching New York. We're now in the process of trying to get that back on track and get it up and running by hopefully early next year at the latest.
I'd like to shift to the Peter Matthiessen Center. How did the idea of the Peter Matthiessen Center first surface, and when was it established?
The idea first surfaced literally in the months after he died in 2014. I was the executor of his estate, and I was horrified to realize that we were going to have to sell the house and property that I was born and raised in and that I grew up in order to pay off the state taxes, etc. So that made me deeply sad because I had just taken it for granted and always thought that I would be part of that house until my own death. And so I was thinking about, how do we save this property? What can we do? And I thought, well, what if we created some kind of environmental center or a writing center? My father was a very popular and unique writer, focused on nature and indigenous people and so on. So why not create some kind of writer's retreat here, right on this property? It's a beautiful property. It's near the ocean. I realized it was going to cost about $30 million, not only buy the property from the family, but also to endow it. So I dropped the idea. The guy who bought it just let it languish, and it became overgrown and just became wild and a terrible mess, but he wasn't doing anything with it. So a few of my father's old Zen students were visiting the area, and they saw the house, and they said, God, this is terrible. We should save this. And so they approached me and my stepmother and asked us what we thought of the idea of starting an environmental or a writer's retreat. And it was exactly the same idea that I had so many years before. And so I said, well, gosh, that's a bit of serendipity. And it looks like I wouldn't be doing this by myself. We would have a whole team of us. So I agreed to join their effort. So I think we got started in earnest in 2019. And the original idea was to buy the property back and then restore the property, restore the gardens, that my mother had so lovingly created, and then established this writer's retreat. Worked on it really hard for 3 years. So we were all lined up, and it fell through. The owner decided not to sell after all. In the time since, we've been working on developing programming around my father's work. We've done a bunch of events, initially online, and then more recently live events here on the East End of Long Island. People really resonate with my father and his work and the programming that we've been able to do. And then last year, we had a terrific idea to create something called the Peter Matthiessen Literary Prize. The idea is to create an annual award, 1 year for fiction, the next year for nonfiction. The difference between this award and what you otherwise see with these awards, even after the prize has been given, we would just use that as a starting point to have a year-long conversation and series of events to create a larger conversation with the public at large and to engage people in the fight to protect our natural environment, to protect indigenous communities. We think there's a lot of excitement among other writers and fans of my father. Our focus is on this prize, and we're very excited about it. So ours is essentially a virtual organization. We are a nonprofit. We are a 501c3. People can make charitable contributions. We are in formal and informal partnership with a lot of other cultural institutions on the East End of Long Island.
So how can listeners learn more about the Peter Matthiessen Center?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I encourage folks to go to mathiessencenter.org online. They can learn all about the organization, our mission, and we encourage everybody to become members. If you have an interest in my father and my father's work, the kinds of issues that he cared about, we would welcome your support and your engagement.
What would you like people to remember most about your father, Peter Matthiessen?
He was a unique writer in that he wrote about the natural world and indigenous people and so on. And he's not the only one to do that, but he wrote about it in a very evocative, lyrical, poetic way that really captured the essence of our natural world, of these indigenous cultures, and did it in a way that I would hope would excite the minds and stimulate the hearts of readers around the world, and in fact have. He was able to penetrate these issues in a way that very few other writers have been able to do, and he wrote some of the most beautiful prose of any American writer. But he also was quite the activist in his non-writing life as well. Got behind different causes. One of the things we didn't talk about is that he took on the cause of trying to help free Leonard Peltier, who's considered globally to be America's #1 political prisoner. And my father spent decades working to free Leonard and to put pressure on the U.S. government to recognize that this was a fraudulent conviction. He just had so many causes like that. He just was an interesting and dynamic guy who went way beyond his writing in terms of the life he led. He was then monk. He was a co-founder of the Paris Review, which is one of the most respected literary magazines in the world. And so he just had a very interesting and varied life. He was a unique observer of the state of humanity and our relationship to nature.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Alex Matthiessen, and that you take the time to visit the Peter Matthiessen Center's website to learn more about the work that they are doing. You can visit them at mathiessencenter.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, do remember, we are nature.